If your father served in the Pacific, if your grandfather did, you know the name Nimitz. You know he won the war. What almost no American knows is what he did the day before the war ended. Not on the deck of the Missouri. Not in front of the cameras, alone, in a shipyard in Yokosuka, in front of an enemy battleship, the Soviet Union. America's own ally had formally demanded to be destroyed. This is that story, and it does not end where you think it ends. Yokosuka, Japan, the first day of September 1945. The war was not yet over, not officially. The papers were still unsigned, the delegations were still assembling. On the deck of an American battleship, anchored in Tokyo Bay, 20 miles to the north, workers were setting up a small wooden table, checking microphones, positioning cameras that would carry the moment to every corner of a world that had been at war for 6 years. But that was tomorrow. Today a man was walking alone through the enemy's most important naval base. He wore a simple khaki uniform. No aides pressed in around him. No reporters trailed behind. He had come without escort, without ceremony, without any of the trappings that a 5-star admiral of the United States Navy could have demanded and received without a word. His name was Chester William Nimitz. He was 60 years old, and for the last 3 years and 8 months he had commanded the largest naval force in the history of human warfare. Now he walked, past the dry docks that had once repaired the battleships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, past the machine shops that had built the torpedoes that had killed his sailors at Guadalcanal and Leyte Gulf, and a dozen smaller places whose names the men back home would never learn to pronounce. Past cranes still standing, but no longer moving. Past the silence of a shipyard that 4 years of American submarines and carrier aircraft had emptied of purpose. And then, at the edge of the harbour, he stopped. There was a ship in front of him, if you could still call it that. It sat on dry land. Its hull was encased in concrete, poured decades before, in an age when men still believed such things could hold time in place. Paint peeled from the upper works in long ribbons. The wooden deck had gone grey from 22 years of sun and salt. American soldiers had already been aboard. Clocks were gone. Fittings were gone. Anything a man could unscrew, pry loose, or fit into a duffel bag had been carried off to become a souvenir in a farmhouse in Iowa or a workshop in Pennsylvania. The ship had a name, Mikasa. If you had walked the corridors of the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis at any point in the first 40 years of the 20th century, you knew that name. Every officer in every navy in the world knew that name. It was the name of the ship on which Admiral Togo had stood on the 27th of May, 1905, and destroyed the Russian Baltic fleet in the Strait of Tsushima. The Russians had sailed 18,000 nautical miles to reach those waters. They had left the Baltic Sea 7 months earlier, dragged their coal-fired warships around the Horn of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, past colonies that would not sell them fuel, past ports that would not let them anchor. When they finally arrived in the waters between Japan and Korea, Togo was waiting. He crossed their line. He concentrated his broadsides against the head of their column. And in 2 days of fighting, 21 Russian warships were sunk. 6 more were captured. The Russian Navy in the Pacific ceased to exist. It was the most decisive naval victory of the 20th century. And now the ship that had led it stood in front of Chester Nimitz, waiting to be destroyed. The Soviet Union wanted it gone. They had leverage. They were at the table. They were one of the 4 Allied powers preparing to dismantle the Japanese Empire, and they had made their demand formal, in writing, through the appropriate channels. Tsushima had cost Russia nearly 5,000 dead, and the humiliation of a fleet that had taken years to build. The concrete hull sitting in Yokosuka harbour was a monument to that humiliation. The Soviets did not want it preserved. They wanted it broken up, cut apart, hauled away, so that the sea and the sky would forget it had ever existed. There was another problem closer to hand. American soldiers were stripping the ship for parts. They came in 2s and 3s, most days. Some were officers, some were enlisted men on liberty. They walked up the gangway, wandered the decks, and took whatever caught their eye. It was not malice. It was what soldiers did when a war ended, and something valuable stood in front of them, and no one told them to stop. Nimitz stood on the dock and looked at the ship. Then he gave an order. Guards, American guards, posted around the clock. No further looting was to occur. No further stripping. No further deterioration of any kind was to be permitted. The question of what happened to Mikasa was, from that moment forward, closed. He did not consult Washington. He did not consult MacArthur. He did not consult the Soviets, who had spent months making the case that this ship was theirs to dismantle. He simply stood on the dock in his khaki uniform on the first day of September 1945, and he said no. Then he walked back to his aircraft, and he flew to Tokyo Bay to prepare for the ceremony that would end the war. This is not the story of how Chester Nimitz won the Pacific War. That story has been told 1,000 times, in books and films and museum exhibits from Honolulu to Washington. This is the story of what he did after he won, which turned out to be the harder thing. To understand why an American admiral stood on a dock in September of 1945 and defied his own ally to save the flagship of his enemy, you have to go back 40 years, to a garden in Tokyo in the summer of 1905. The war between Russia and Japan had just ended. The Emperor of Japan, Meiji, was throwing a party. It was not a private affair. It was a celebration of national victory, staged in the Imperial Gardens, with officers of every allied and neutral nation invited to attend. The Japanese had done something the Western world had spent a long time telling itself was not possible. They had defeated a European great power in open battle. Not through diplomacy, not through insurrection, in the field and at sea, with modern weapons and modern tactics, they had beaten Russia. The garden that afternoon was full of men in uniform who were still trying to understand what that meant. Among them was a young American officer, an ensign, 20 years old, who had graduated from the Naval Academy earlier that year and been assigned to the battleship USS Ohio for a Western Pacific cruise. He had not chosen to be there. He had been selected, along with a handful of other American officers, because someone in Washington believed young naval officers ought to see this kind of thing. His name was Chester Nimitz. He walked through the garden, he drank the tea, he listened to the toasts, and at some point in the afternoon, a small group of guests parted, and the old admiral came into view. Heiichiro Togo was 57 years old that summer. He was not a large man. He was not loud. He wore his dress uniform without decoration or display. He had studied naval science in England for 7 years as a young man aboard training ships of the Royal Navy, and he had come home and applied everything he had learned with a patience and thoroughness that the Japanese military brought to every subject it decided was worth mastering. He had commanded from the bridge of Mikasa throughout the war with Russia. He had stood in the open, in view of his men and his enemy, because that was what a commanding officer was expected to do in the year 1905. At Tsushima he had made no speeches. Before the battle began, he had raised a single signal flag. It read, "The rise or fall of the empire depends upon this battle. Let every man do his utmost." Then he had crossed the enemy's line, and when it was over, he had done something the young ensign standing in the garden that afternoon would remember for the rest of his life. 3 weeks after the battle, Togo had gone to a hospital in the naval town of Sasebo in the south of Japan. In a bed on that ward lay Vice Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, the commander of the Russian Baltic Fleet, the man Togo had just defeated. Rozhestvensky had been wounded during the battle. His flagship had been sunk beneath him. He had been pulled unconscious from a destroyer and transferred to a Japanese hospital ship and brought ashore. Togo walked into the ward. He sat down beside the bed. He took the wounded Russian's hand. According to the accounts of officers who were present, he spoke quietly. "Defeat," he said, "is a common fate for fighting men. There is no need to grieve if we have done our duty." There were no photographers. There was no press release. The Japanese newspapers noted the visit briefly and moved on. It was one commander going to see another commander who had been wounded in a battle between them. Whatever passed between them in that hospital room stayed in that room, but it did not stay hidden. Word of it reached the foreign naval attachés. Word of it reached the American embassy. Word of it reached, eventually, the ensign standing in the garden a few weeks later, watching the man who had done it move through the crowd. Togo did not perform. He did not accept the reverence that a man of his standing could have demanded and received without effort. He talked to the young American officers the way a man talks when he has nothing left to prove. When the work is done and the record speaks for itself, and there is no longer any need to be anything other than what he actually is. Nimitz left no diary entry describing the conversation, no letter home, no written record of what was said between them, if anything was said at all. But something settled into him that afternoon. You can tell because of what he did 29 years later. In 1934, Admiral Togo died. He was 86 years old. His funeral was a national event in Japan, a country that had built a mythology around him, that treated him the way Americans of that era treated Washington or Grant. Foreign delegations were invited. Diplomatic representatives were expected to attend the public ceremony. Chester Nimitz, by then a captain in the United States Navy, 49 years old, with a full schedule and duties that did not pause for travel to foreign countries, went to Tokyo. He attended the public funeral. Then he attended the private family funeral as well. No order from the Navy Department required his presence. No protocol demanded that he attend the family service alongside relatives. He went because he wanted to be there. He went because something about that afternoon in the garden had stayed with him through the years of submarines and shore assignments and quiet promotions. He never explained it publicly. He didn't have to. Now it was the summer of 1945. The empire that Togo had helped to build was in ruins. The navy Togo had commanded was on the bottom of the Pacific. 66 Japanese cities had been burned. 2 more had been destroyed by weapons the world had never seen before. Millions were dead. The survivors were starving, and in a harbour south of Tokyo, the ship Togo had stood waiting to be broken up. Chester Nimitz walked up to that ship on the first day of September 1945, and he made a decision. He did not make it for Togo. He did not make it for Japan. He did not make it because he had grown soft or forgiving or sentimental about an enemy he had spent 4 years destroying. He made it because 40 years earlier he had seen something in a garden in Tokyo, and he had never forgotten it. Tomorrow, on the deck of the Missouri, the war would end. Today, a ship that a Soviet ally wanted destroyed, and American soldiers were quietly looting, had been given a stay of execution by the one man in the Pacific, whose word on the matter was final. He posted the guards. Then he flew north to Tokyo Bay to end the war, the 30th of May, 1934. Tokyo. By the time the funeral procession began, the streets from the residence in Aoyama to the parade ground at Hibiya were lined shoulder to shoulder with the people of Japan, standing in silence. They had come by the tens of thousands, old men who remembered the war with Russia, young men who had grown up hearing the name Togo, the way boys in Missouri had grown up hearing Grant, widows in dark kimono, school children in neat rows, holding paper flags they did not wave. The emperor had declared a period of national mourning. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suspended routine operations across the empire. Haihachiro Togo was dead. He was 86 years old. And somewhere in the crowd, in a foreign uniform, stood an American naval officer with dark hair going grey at the temples and blue eyes that missed nothing. Chester Nimitz was 49 years old. He was a captain in the United States Navy, an experienced submariner, a graduate of the Naval War College, a man on a career track that would eventually put him in command of fleets. He had not been sent to Tokyo. The Navy Department had issued no orders directing his presence. The State Department had not requested his attendance. The American Embassy would have sent a junior military attaché to the ceremony as a matter of protocol, and that would have been sufficient. Nimitz came anyway. He came on his own time, he came at his own expense, and he did not come only for the public ceremony. There was a private family service that afternoon, held in the traditional manner, with only relatives and close associates of the deceased in attendance. It was not open to foreign officers. It was not open to the press. It was the small, quiet gathering that a Japanese family holds when the loud part is over, and the world has been asked to look away. Nimitz was there for that one too. There is no photograph of him at that service. There is no diary entry describing what he saw. Whatever he thought about, sitting in that room among strangers who were burying a father and a grandfather, he kept to himself, the way he kept most things. He had been 20 years old when he had first seen Togo in that garden. He was 49 now. Between those two moments lay the years of his career. Submarines in the early days, when submarines were dangerous and unglamorous and mostly ignored. Shore assignments in California and Washington. The Naval War College, where he had studied Tsushima the way theologians study scripture, going over Togo's decisions turn by turn, signal by signal, trying to understand not just what the man had done, but why. Now the man was gone. Nimitz stayed for the full service. Then he flew home to San Diego and returned to his duties without giving an interview about the trip, without publishing an essay about what Togo had meant to the profession, without saying much of anything to anyone about why he had gone. 7 years later, on the 7th of December 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft launched from 6 flight decks in the North Pacific and destroyed most of the United States Pacific Fleet as it lay at anchor in Pearl Harbor. 18 days after that, on Christmas morning of 1941, Chester Nimitz arrived in Hawaii. 6 days later, on the last day of the year, on the deck of a submarine, because there was no battleship left to stand on, he took command of what was left. He walked through the harbor at first light. Battleships lay overturned in the mud. The oil on the surface of the water was so thick it could still be lit with a match. Bodies were still being pulled from the wreckage of the Arizona. The stink of it, of burned fuel and salt and death, would not leave the harbor for months. He stood there in his khaki uniform and said very little. Then he went to his office and began the war. He built the fleet back from nothing. He picked the men who would command the carriers at Midway and the Coral Sea. He signed the operational orders that sent submarines into the Japanese shipping lanes, that stripped the empire of its oil and its rice and its steel. He approved the campaigns that pushed the Imperial Japanese Navy from Guadalcanal to the Philippine Sea to Leyte Gulf, until at the end there was almost nothing left of it to push. By the summer of 1945, the fleet that had once flown Togo's flag was on the bottom of the Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as a fighting force, and Chester Nimitz had done it. He had done it deliberately. He had done it thoroughly. He had done it without hesitation and without apology. That is the man who walked up to the Mikasa on the first day of September 1945. The next morning, the 2nd of September, dawned grey and cool over Tokyo Bay. 250 warships lay at anchor. The battleship Missouri rode among them, her 9 16-inch guns pointed toward the mainland, her decks scrubbed clean for the occasion. A small wooden table had been set on the veranda deck. On it lay 2 copies of the surrender documents, one bound in leather for the Allies, one in canvas for the Japanese. Nimitz stood in his khaki uniform among the flag officers. He was not at the microphone. That was General Douglas MacArthur. There had been a decision made about that. Weeks earlier, in Washington, the war in the Pacific had been fought primarily by the Navy and the Marine Corps. The Army had played its part, and its part had been substantial, but it had not been the service that had crossed the ocean island by island. It had not been the service that had lost its ships at Savo Sound and Leyte Gulf. It had not been the service whose submariners had gone out on patrol and not come home. But the man selected to receive the surrender was an Army general. Nimitz had objected, quietly, through the proper channels, to the people who needed to hear it. He had made his case to Admiral King in Washington. He had not raised it with the press. He had not raised it with MacArthur. He had said what needed to be said to the men who could act on it, and when the decision came back that it would be MacArthur at the microphone, he had accepted it and gone on with the work, because that was the job. MacArthur stepped to the microphone. He spoke for 4 minutes. Then the Japanese delegation was called forward. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed for the government. General Yoshijiro Umezu signed for the Imperial General Staff. Both men stepped back. Then MacArthur walked to the table. He was carrying 5 pens. They were held loosely in his hand, 5 identical fountain pens, arranged in a specific order. He had planned this. Every one of those pens had a destination, chosen in advance, chosen for a reason, and the reason in every case had something to do with Douglas MacArthur. He signed his name across the leather-bound document. The first pen he used, he passed to General Jonathan Wainwright, who had surrendered the Philippines in 1942, after MacArthur had been ordered to Australia. Wainwright had spent 3 years in a Japanese prison camp. He was 62 years old that morning. He had come to the ceremony so gaunt that his dress uniform hung on him like clothing on a scarecrow. He took the pen. The second pen went to British General Arthur Percival, who had surrendered Singapore in 1942 and who had spent the war in Japanese captivity, ending up in the same prison camp in Manchuria as Wainwright. The third pen was set aside to be sent to the United States Military Academy at West Point, MacArthur's alma mater. The fourth would go home to his wife. The fifth, MacArthur kept for himself. 5 pens, 5 destinations. A performance staged and rehearsed and delivered flawlessly on the deck of an American battleship in front of the cameras of the world. Then it was Nimitz's turn. He walked to the table. He had 1 pen, a green Parker fountain pen. It had been given to him by a friend before the ceremony. He had not thought about who he would give it to afterward. because he did not intend to give it to anyone. He signed his name. A yeoman standing beside the table reached out. Nimitz handed him the pen. Then he stepped back. A war correspondent covering the ceremony wrote that evening, in a dispatch that ran in newspapers across the United States the next morning, that Admiral Nimitz signed and withdrew so quickly that it was easy to miss he had been there at all. The war was over. Nimitz's aircraft turned toward Pearl Harbor. There was a final report to write, several hundred pages, covering every major campaign from the 12th of December, 1941, to the day the papers were signed. He named the decisions that had been correct. He named the operations that had succeeded, and why. When he came to the failures, he described what had happened, and he did not name the officers who had been responsible. He submitted the report to the Navy Department. It received almost no press coverage. He did not mention that to anyone either. Back in Yokosuka, the Mikasa sat under American guard. The history of that ship up to that summer was itself a story. It had been built in England. The Japanese, in 1899, did not yet have the industrial capacity to build a pre-dreadnought battleship of the modern type, and so the Imperial Japanese Navy had contracted with the Vickers Shipyard at Barrow-in-Furness, on the northwest coast of England, to build the vessel that would eventually become Togo's flagship. She was completed in 1902 and delivered to Japan. 3 years later, she led the fleet at Tsushima. 3.5 months after the greatest naval victory in 40 years, on the 11th of September 1905, an accidental explosion in the after magazine sent Mikasa to the bottom of Sasebo Harbor. 250 men of her crew were killed. The war was already effectively over. The Treaty of Portsmouth had been signed 6 days earlier in the state of New Hampshire, with President Theodore Roosevelt as mediator. The ship that had won the war had sunk in port, in peacetime, killing more of its own men than the Russians had managed to kill during the entire battle. She was raised, she was repaired. She served through the First World War. She participated in naval operations against Bolshevik forces in the Russian Civil War, in the waters off Vladivostok. In 1923, following the Washington Naval Treaty that limited the size of the world's battleship fleets, she was decommissioned. The Japanese government arranged for her preservation as a memorial ship. Her hull was encased in concrete at Yokosuka, permanently fixed in place, and she was opened to the public in 1926. Present at the dedication were the retired Admiral Togo, then 78 years old, and Crown Prince Hirohito, who would ascend to the throne later that same year. That was the ship the Soviets now wanted destroyed, and that was the ship Nimitz had, on the 1st of September, quietly placed under American guard. No memorandum to the State Department, no lobbying of MacArthur, no debate at any Allied conference, just an order, issued at the operational level, by the officer with the authority to issue it. A fait accompli. The Soviets protested. The protest went nowhere, and the looting by his own soldiers, had not stopped either. He was posting American guards on an enemy warship to keep American servicemen off it. He did it anyway. Then he flew to Washington. President Truman had nominated him to succeed Admiral Ernest King as Chief of Naval Operations. The Senate had confirmed him. On the 15th of December, 1945, Chester Nimitz took the oath of office and became the senior uniformed officer of the United States Navy. He hated it. He said so, not to reporters, but to his wife. Catherine Nimitz had known him since he was a young officer. She had followed him from station to station across 4 decades of service. She had raised their children in Navy housing on both coasts, and she had watched him carry the weight of the Pacific War for 3 years, 8 months without complaint. Now in Washington, in the quiet of their quarters at night, he told her the truth. At Pearl Harbor, in the darkest months of 1942, when the fleet was gone and the war was going badly, and the burden was almost more than a man could carry, every decision he'd made had meant something real. He could see what he had to work with. He could see what the enemy had. When he moved a carrier, ships moved. When he signed an operational order, men went into combat. A wrong decision meant sailors died. A right one meant enemy sailors died instead. The weight of it was terrible, but it was honest. In Washington, a wrong decision meant a budget line moved by 3%. A right decision meant a committee chairman felt respected. He sat in hearings about aircraft procurement. He sat in hearings about the reorganization of the armed forces. He watched the Army Air Forces separate into what would become On the 18th of September 1947, the United States Air Force. He watched the newly created Department of Defense begin to consolidate authority that had once belonged to the individual services. He served for 2 years. On the 15th of December 1947, exactly 2 years to the day after he had taken the oath, he handed the office to his successor, Admiral Louis Denfeld, and walked out of the building. He did not write his memoirs. A publisher offered him a substantial advance. Other flag officers of the war were writing theirs. MacArthur would eventually write his. Halsey wrote his. King wrote his. The books were popular. They sold well. They shaped how Americans would remember the war for generations. Nimitz declined. He never explained why in public. To the men closest to him, he said, more than once, that writing a book about the war would be a way of holding on to the war. Of staying on the battlefield after the shooting had stopped. Of asking to be remembered for something that ought to be allowed to end. He had done the work. The work was finished. He flew back to California, to Yerba Buena Island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, where the Navy maintained quarters for retired flag officers. He walked in the mornings. He tended a garden, he read. For most of the next decade, he was quiet. But somewhere in Japan, in a harbor south of Tokyo, a ship was still standing under American guard, and a group of men who had once served in the Navy that ship had led were beginning to plan. Yokosuka, 1958. 13 years had passed since the ceremony on the Missouri. Japan was no longer the country the American Navy had occupied. The occupation had ended 6 years earlier in 1952. The Treaty of San Francisco had restored Japanese sovereignty. The emperor was still on his throne. The government was elected. The economy, which had been reduced to almost nothing in the summer of 1945, was climbing back with the quiet ferocity that the Japanese brought to every task they decided was worth doing. But there was still one thing in that country that Japan could not bring itself to look at. The Mikasa was still in her concrete berth. She had survived the war. She had survived the Soviet demand for demolition. She had survived the American guards, who had eventually gone home, and the years afterward, when no one was guarding anything at all. She had not survived well. The wooden decks had rotted. The upper works had rusted through in places. Weeds had grown in the seams between the concrete and the steel. Somewhere along the way, an entrepreneur with a lease and no reverence had installed a nightclub on the aft deck and an aquarium on the forward deck, and, for a period of years, the ship on which Togo had won the greatest naval victory of the 20th century had been a place where American servicemen came to drink beer and look at tropical fish. The Japanese who walked past her did not look at her. She was an embarrassment now. She was a reminder of a war that had ended in the destruction of 2 cities, and a defeat that had cost millions of lives, and a version of Japan that many Japanese preferred not to remember. The proud thing had become the shameful thing. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but a few of them wanted to fix it. They were older men, mostly, retired officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, historians. A handful of civilians who had grown up in the years when the Mikasa had still meant something, and who could not bear to watch her rot in silence. They formed a preservation committee. They needed money, a great deal of money. The estimated cost of a full restoration ran into the hundreds of millions of yen, at a time when Japan was still poor, and the government was in no position to fund the rehabilitation of a symbol of imperial military pride. They needed something else, too. They needed a name that would open doors on both sides of the Pacific. A name that would tell Americans this was not a project of unrepentant militarists, and tell Japanese this was not a project of foreign patronage. A name that carried weight in both countries. There was really only one name that fit. They wrote a letter, in English, to an address in California. Yerba Buena Island, the middle of San Francisco Bay. Chester Nimitz was in his early 70s. He had been retired from active duty for 11 years. He walked in the mornings. He tended his garden. His hearing had begun to fail, and his eyesight was not what it had been, but his mind was clear, and he still opened his own mail. The letter arrived. He read it. He had no obligation to answer. He had no obligation to do anything. He had earned the right to spend the rest of his life exactly as he was spending it, on an island in the fog, walking down to the water in the mornings and coming back for breakfast, and letting the years go by without asking anything of them. He wrote back. He enclosed a personal check. It was drawn on his own account, It was not a solicitation of Navy funds, or a request to Congress, or an appeal to any veterans organization. It was his own money. He was the first American to contribute to the Mikasa Preservation Fund. And he authorized the committee to use his name in their fundraising materials in the United States, which meant that when the letters went out to American donors, the name at the top belonged to the man who had commanded the Pacific Fleet. That opened the doors. American money began to flow, not enormous sums, but enough. Contributions came in from veterans organizations, from naval officers, active and retired, from private citizens who had read something in a newspaper and had written a check for $10 and mailed it to Yokosuka. Not everyone in America was pleased. The country was still full of men who had spent time in Japanese prison camps, men who had survived the Bataan Death March, men who had lost brothers on Wake Island and sons at Iwo Jima and friends in the waters off Okinawa. For many of them, the war had not ended in 1945. It had simply gone quiet. The idea of an American admiral raising money to preserve a Japanese battleship did not sit easily with everyone who read about it in the newspapers. Some resented it. Some said so out loud. Some wrote letters. Nimitz did not respond. He did not write letters to newspapers defending himself. He did not issue statements. He did not stop contributing. He did not stop lending his name. He let the criticism exist, without answering it, without excusing it, without pretending it wasn't there. Then he went back to his garden. The restoration took almost 3 years. Japanese craftsmen worked slowly and carefully, in the manner Japanese craftsmen have always worked when they are restoring something they believe matters. They removed the nightclub. They removed the aquarium. They stripped away the years of neglect. They rebuilt the upper works. They restored the bridge to something close to how it had looked on the morning of the 27th of May, 1905. They set the date for the reopening. They chose it deliberately. The 27th of May, 1961, 56 years to the day after Togo had raised the signal flag and crossed the Russian line at Tsushima. The ceremony was held on the ship's foredeck. Speeches were made. Officers of the newly reconstituted Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force stood at attention. A statue of Admiral Togo was unveiled on the grounds beside the ship. He was in the pose he had held on the bridge that morning, one hand on the rail, the other at his side, looking out across a sea that was no longer there. Nimitz was not present. He was in his mid-70s, and his health had begun its long, slow decline, and the trip from California to Japan was more than his doctors would allow. But the Mikasa was open again, and she has never closed since. Chester Nimitz died on the 20th of February 1966. He was 80 years old. He passed quietly at his quarters on Yerba Buena Island, his wife Catherine at his side. He had left instructions for his funeral. They were specific. He wanted no state funeral. He wanted no cannon salute. He wanted no motorcade through Washington. He wanted no ceremony at Arlington. He wanted a small service in California, near where he had died, and he wanted to be buried in Golden Gate National Cemetery, in a plot next to 3 other flag officers who had been his contemporaries, and his instructions were followed exactly. The service was small. The Navy sent representatives. The government sent representatives. The nation lowered its flags for the required period. And then it was done, and he was in the ground, and the war he had commanded was 10 years, and change into its long fade from active memory. There is a small town in the Texas Hill Country called Fredericksburg. It sits in Gillespie County, about 70 miles west of Austin. It was settled by German immigrants 1846, and it has kept that character. Old stone buildings, live oaks, cedar-covered hills that don't look like anywhere else in Texas. Chester Nimitz was born there on the 24th of February 1885. His grandfather had run a hotel on Main Street. The old man had built it in the shape of a ship with a wooden bridge on the roof, because he had been a merchant sailor in his youth, and he wanted his descendants in Texas to remember the sea. The locals called it the Steamboat Hotel. It is still there. It still looks like a ship. You can walk past it today, and you would not know what it was if no one told you. After the war, a museum was established in Nimitz's honor, using the old hotel as its centerpiece. It told the story of the Pacific War. It told the story of the men who had fought it, on both sides, and the ships they had fought it in. It did not tell the story of Chester Nimitz alone. He had asked, when he was still alive, that it not. 10 years after he died, on the 8th of May, 1976, Something new was dedicated at the museum, a Japanese garden. It was not small. It was not a decorative feature added to fill a corner of the grounds. It was a full traditional Japanese garden, with stone lanterns, a koi pond, and carefully shaped plantings, the kind of garden that takes years to design and years more to build, and that requires the presence of craftsmen who have spent their lives learning how to do this specific thing. Japanese craftsmen came to Texas to build it. They were brought over by the Association of Former Japanese Naval Officers, an organization that had been founded after the war by veterans of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and that had raised the funds and organized the workmen and shipped the stones across the Pacific. They called it the Garden of Peace. It was their gift to a town in Texas that most of them had never seen, to a museum honoring a man who had spent 4 years destroying the Navy in which most of them had served. Nimitz had been dead for 10 years. He never knew it was being built. He never saw the drawings. He never met the men who came from Japan to build it. He never walked the paths, or sat by the pond, or heard the wind in the pines that were planted along its edges. He had asked to be remembered quietly. The Japanese remembered him anyway. Now here is what the record shows. Chester Nimitz commanded the United States Pacific Fleet from the 31st of December 1941 to the 2nd of September 1945. He oversaw the campaigns that pushed the Imperial Japanese Navy out of the Central Pacific. He signed the operational orders that sent American submarines into Japanese shipping lanes, where they sank more than half of the Japanese merchant marine, and by doing so, cut off the food and fuel that kept the home islands alive. He approved the amphibious assaults that killed thousands of American Marines and tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers on beaches at Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. He was one of the senior officers who ratified the plan to bomb Japanese cities, and he knew what that meant, and he did not object. He was not a gentleman about any of it. He was not supposed to be. That was the job. And when the job was done, he did not linger over it. He did not need to hold on to it. He did not need the trophies, or the ceremonies, or the pens on the surrender document, or the microphone on the veranda deck of the Missouri. He signed his name. He put his pen in his pocket. He went back to Pearl Harbor to write his report. He served 2 years as Chief of Naval Operations because the Navy asked him to. He resigned on the day his term ended, and he went home. There are men who need the battlefield after the battle is over. They need to stand on it and point to where they stood. They need the flags and the bronze plaques and the statues in their own likeness. Chester Nimitz was not one of those men. The most visible thing he left behind in his own country is a museum in a small town in Texas, in the building his grandfather built to look like a ship. It is a museum about the war, not about the man. The most visible thing he left behind in Japan is a battleship. It stands today just outside the gates of Commander Fleet Activities Yokosuka, the largest American naval base in the Western Pacific, home port of the United States 7th Fleet. Every year, on the 27th of May, the commander of United States Naval Forces Japan goes aboard Mikasa for a memorial ceremony, alongside officers of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. The two navies that spent 4 years trying to destroy each other now stand on the deck of a ship that one of them built, and one of them helped save. That ship does not belong to Chester Nimitz. It belongs to Haihachiro Togo. It always did. Nimitz would have said so himself, if you had asked him. He had seen Togo in a garden in Tokyo in the summer of 1905, when he was 20 years old, and Togo was 57, and the 20th century had barely begun. He had watched him move through a crowd of young foreign officers with nothing to prove, and no need to be anything other than what he was. That afternoon settled into him and stayed there. 56 years later, on the day he wrote a check that he did not have to write, for a ship that was not his to save, in a country he had helped to destroy, he was still thinking about it. He never explained it publicly. He didn't have to. If your father served in the Pacific, if your grandfather flew off a carrier or stood watch on a destroyer, or crawled up a beach, nobody in your family talks about, this is the moment. Put his name in the comments, the branch, the ship, whatever you know, because the men in this story did not fight for the monuments. They fought so the people sitting where you're sitting right now would never have to. The least we can do is say their names out loud. Don't let them disappear.